Well, your next book, though, is Back Home, and it's a fictional account,
Yes,
I
it's
believe,
fiction. Yes.
of the impact of a soldier's experience in the Iraq War on his daughter.
Yes.
Now, what made you decide to write fiction instead of the nonfiction for which you've won a Pulitzer and is your bread and butter working at the Chicago Tribune?
Sheer cussedness, apparently.
Okay.
No, I had done a long series for the Tribune on traumatic brain injury. I spent 5 months at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago watching 5 families as a loved one went through the process of rehabilitation. We give a lot of attention to the acute care setting, to emergency rooms. Mm-hmm. There's a whole show devoted to it, ER. But there isn't a show called Rehab, and the reason is because rehab is slow. It's just as critical, just as crucial, and can make a huge difference in the quality of life for the injured person. And very little attention is given to rehab for traumatic brain injury, because for many years it was thought that once you injure the brain, those injured neurons never recovered, that part of the brain would never be available to you. But now what we've discovered is something quite different. The brain has what's called plasticity. It can rebuild itself and remake itself in response to what happens to it. So we've had all these strides, but I hadn't ever seen a story done on it. So I follow these families. As I began to read about the Iraq War in recent years, that you've often probably heard it said that traumatic brain injury, sadly, is going to be the signature injury of this war, primarily because of concussive injuries, roadside bombs, IEDs. Mm-hmm. We have at least 300,000 returning service personnel with some degree of TBI, either mild or severe. This is a tremendous problem that we as a country are going to be dealing with because, of course, we owe these service personnel and their families our very best efforts. It's going to be, it's a lifelong diagnosis. And to my mind, we really haven't come to terms with that yet. This story, I originally began to write it from the perspective of the wife, of the soldier's wife. He's a National Guardsman. He was a regular guy in his 40s, a family, goes to Iraq, serves his country, has this terrible injury. He has a prosthetic arm and leg as well as the brain injury, but it's the brain injury that is the critical difference in his life, and that's what I wanted to emphasize. Physical injuries, people can see and are sympathetic toward, but a brain injury is invisible, and yet it changes personality. It changes who the person is. So it has a cataclysmic impact on the family, and that's what I wanted to chronicle. The moment I changed the voice and wrote it from the perspective of the 13-year-old daughter, the story just unspooled to me. It just really came to me almost instantly.
Why do you think that is? Why was it such a difference writing as the daughter?
It's a great question. Maybe because that story hadn't been told. I mean, there's a lot of stories about soldiers and soldiers' wives from the perspective of the soldier, the perspective of journalists. We're having this spate of very, very good books that are coming out now, both fiction and nonfiction, from all those perspectives. But the one I hadn't seen was the child, an older child. Again, there's always a lot of attention to a toddler. We see returning service people, and they're always, scooping up a small child. Mm-hmm. But how about a teenager, 13, 14 years old? There's a great line in a Sebastian Barry, he's a great Irish novel, Sebastian Barry novel, where he says, there is no one so old as a 15-year-old girl, meaning by that point, you really get the world. You're still a kid. There are a lot of things you can't do, a lot of things you wonder about, a lot of things you don't know about, but you get the world. You are aware of the world in all of its acuteness and all of its dangers and all of its joys.
Okay. Did you find it freeing to write fiction because you don't have to stick to this completely factual, or is it harder because you had to create events, you had to create the characters?
Oh, I never thought of it in terms of freeing. It's such an utterly different experience. I wrote it at the same time I was writing Gatling. I was fortunate enough to be a visiting professor at Princeton during fall semester in 2006, and I would work on Back Home in the mornings, yellow legal pad, my feet up on my coffee table, kind of scribbling along. And then I would put that away and then go teach and then spend my afternoons and evenings in the basement of the Firestone Library at Princeton, which is this wonderland, of course.
Taking notes or writing on a yellow legal pad.
Yes.
How did you do the one on Gatling? Yellow legal pad, computer.
Computer.
Why?
Great question.
Why the difference?
I do work that I consider, how do I put this? It's going to sound demeaning to people that do the other. Work that I consider truly creative, which is coming out of the soul of me, unleavened by other people's experiences or perspectives. I write by hand. There's that tactile sense. I'm sure you've heard this from other writers and possibly for yourself as well. But when I'm doing work, like the Gatling work, where every word is factual, where there's nothing made up. A phrase I like is the member of the Bloomsbury Group was Desmond McCarthy, who referred to nonfiction writers as artists under oath. So you have to have, I mean, we have this covenant with the reader that what you're reading is true and real. And I find the computer easier for that, going back and forth between files. But with the yellow legal pad and the pen, something about it is more freeing, perhaps. I think your word's a good one. The Utica series was actually written by hand. I had all my notes. I had done months and months of research. I had hundreds of interviews. I was all ready to go. And when I was sitting there at work in front of the computer, I was finding it very hard to make it into a story. And it needed to be a story. The facts were already out there. The tornado itself and its aftermath had been very thoroughly covered, very well covered by our Metro staff. So all I had to offer was the narrative and the months and months of interviews and practically living with these people, including one of the families that was trapped in the rubble who lost a son in the tornado. So I sat down with all my notes around me and wrote it by hand, and then, of course, went back to work late at night under cover of darkness and keyboarded it in, because had my bosses, I think, ever known I was doing that, I would have been, if not a laughingstock, then unemployed probably, because that's just not done.
Right. And now we have that to blackmail you with. We can send that out. So you're a journalist for a while. Journalism is under attack from many quarters. Bloggers, the internet, Craigslist, I was surprised to find out, has had a strong impact on newspapers because they don't get the classified ad.
Probably the biggest impact is Craigslist. It's not sexy sounding, but that's the one that was the first real body blow. You
know, that's funny because the other person that described it also used the word "it's not sexy," but Craigslist, because that's a fascinating sort of parallel. Everybody always says Craigslist isn't sexy, but it's killing us.
Well, because everybody loves to talk. We all love to be chin-stroking media theorists and sit around and quote our Marshall McLuhan and our this and that and our NYU and MIT Media Lab and all that. But what it really comes down to is, how are you going to make money? How are you going to make money with what you do? And I mean, it comes back to the patent system. There's nothing dirty or shameful about wondering how you're going to make money at something. It's a perfectly proper and appropriate question to ask. Who's going to pay for it? And how do you make this work? Because we all need money to live. And I wish we'd kind of not have the profit motive. It's fallen to a bit of disrepute in this country, and I don't understand it. I mean, you've got to make money.
Right. Well, what do you think of the next 10 years? What do they bring to journalism? What is your crystal ball? It's a totally unfair question.
Well, but it's always the first one I'm asked. I spoke at the Thurber House earlier this week, and or last week, and recently I've done probably 4 or 5 speaking engagements just bunched in a row, and that's always the first question, which is a good sign. It means that people care about this benighted business of ours, and they recognize that newspapers play a crucial role in the community, in the world, in people learning to read, everything from our crossword puzzles to our comics to, of course, the wonderful investigative stories we do. I mean, who's going to be there when the city council meets? Who's going to be there when the fire commission meets and the library board and all that? The idea that we would simply wait for press releases and then put them online is a real chilling thought. Trust but verify. Works for missile defense, and it works for any kind of government entity as well. We will always have journalism, but the question, of course, is what form it will be delivered in and who will pay for it. There's a great, great change going on right now, which is a good thing. When I'm talking to students, I always say, 20 years ago, if you started in this business, in the journalism business, there was one route. You would hopefully get on at the Boston Globe or the Chicago Tribune or the New York Times or the LA Times. That was it. You'd start a smaller paper, off you went, then somebody would see you, offer you a book contract, you'd be doing big stories, and that was the route. So if you didn't want to go that route, suppose you didn't want to move to a big city. Suppose that wasn't your career trajectory the way you saw it. Now there are 1,000 different routes. No one can say what the route is. There's never been a more exciting time in this business. So challenging, yes. Many of my very good friends have lost their jobs. I mean, the Tribune is a very grim place now, and I think even the bosses who've had to make those difficult decisions would agree. It's not an outcome that they would have preferred either. We're going through a terrible cataclysmic change right now. But on the other side of that is going to be something new and different. And I think if you're a young person or an old person or a middle-aged person today, and you're a writer and you want to write, now's the time. It's like we're the steamboats, and we hear this thing called the railroad in the distance, and we're thinking, I don't know, railroads. Do you think it'll fly? I don't know. But we all are going to have to climb aboard, and how to figure out to keep doing what we're doing with the ethical standards and the standards of thoroughness and fairness that journalists have traditionally brought to print media, and somehow keep those intact as we move into this new world.